What's your date of birth?
4/3/26.
So what did your dad do for a living?
He was the organist at First Presbyterian Church at 5th and 12th. He had a small church in Brooklyn first, and then he worked at to make extra money, he would do the Jewish service on Friday night. But he went to organ school in New York for 2 years, and then he studied in Paris for 3 months. So he was quite renowned in the New York area among organists.
So you grew up in a musical family. Was your mother also musical?
Well, he and mother met in her church choir. And the music missed me. I learned to appreciate good music, but I can't perform. I can't carry a tune. My grade school music teacher in public school asked me please not to sing so lustily because I was getting the whole group off tune. But I was having such a good time.
So you grew up in the Brooklyn area?
Born in Brooklyn, but raised in Queens.
Okay. Yikes. Yikes. How did you sort out your baseball interests between the Yankees and the Dodgers?
I was a Giants fan. The Yankees in my era were known as the rich man's team because they could buy anybody they wanted. Most of the true New Yorkers were either for the Giants or the Dodgers, but when television first came out, it was fascinating if it happened to be the Yankees and the Giants or the Yankees and the Dodgers. All the little stores would put televisions in their windows, and you'd try to walk down the street during a playoff game, and you'd have to walk in the street because everybody was standing on the sidewalks watching the baseball games on television. So no, I was a Giant. My mother was born and raised in Brooklyn, so it was quite a thing in the family because we had Giant and Dodger families, but none of us were Yankee fans. I just remember more when the first Negro player came to play and he couldn't stay in the same hotels as the rest of the team because there were still places in the South that wouldn't let the Negro players stay in the hotels with the white players.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
It was a Sunday. Where I lived in Queens, it was a peninsula. And the thing to do on Sunday afternoon was what we called walking around the point. And then we either went to Peggy's house or my house, and we made hot chocolate afterwards. Well, this particular Sunday, she was coming to my house, and we walked in the living room, and my mother, with her music background, there was always some kind of a concert on the radio on Sunday afternoon. And she was listening to the radio, and it had been interrupted for Pearl Harbor. So I remember that clearly. Whereas your generation's going to remember 9/11. Mine remembers Pearl Harbor.
Do you remember the reaction of your parents or anybody else immediately thereafter?
Not immediately, because see, I was 15 then. And it was when I got into high school more. Some of the older boys were leaving to go in service, and you knew somebody's brother or some relative was getting involved in the war at that time. And then mother began doing Red Cross work at this hospital I told you in Fort Taunton. So that brought it to real. And as I say, with the blackouts, that brought it to reality because, as I say, the first night we were all excused from not having our homework done because there was a blackout, so how can you see to do homework? But then we were all told that if you had a basement, put some boards in your basement windows and do your homework down there, which we had to do. That it was no longer an excuse to come in just because there was a blackout. And then there were patrol people, air raid something or other they were called. And when there was a blackout, there'd be somebody walking up and down the street to see if they could see the planes or where the bombs were coming. And fortunately, nothing ever came. The first impact really was, which I'd made a note here, our high school graduation was in Bayside High School, which was next door to Douglaston. And several of the boys went from graduation to the service. They either had been enlisted and they were giving an exemption till they graduated, or they were being drafted and they were giving an exemption till graduation day. I think that was really the first hard hit. And then as time went on, there was always somebody who had heard that somebody had died over there. The first one that we lost was not a close friend, but we were close enough that we all went to visit his mother after it had happened.
People write letters, did you do
Yes.
something like that?
And they had a special kind of paper. It was like a tissue paper, but a little stronger. And if you wrote on that, it went much faster. And all our letters were addressed to the service person when they were overseas in care of a P.O. box in either Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, depending upon whether they were in Europe or in Asia. And we would get letters back in this same kind of paper, and there would be sentences that were blacked out because everything was censored before it could come to us. So you'd get a letter with a great big black line in it, and you had no idea what was underneath it. But that was I mean, you could use regular mail and regular paper, but it would take much longer to get there.
Was there a specific name or just Dear Soldier?
Oh no, we wrote to specific people, and all the girls wrote to each other's boyfriends. You didn't just write to your boyfriend. Everybody wrote to everybody so that they'd all get mail. And as I say, there were many boys that I wrote to where there was no romantic attachment, but they would write back and we would back and forth just so that everybody got mail. Although it was amazing over a period of time that eventually they may never have lost what they had with that person, but they were able to find a lifetime mate.
Oh, how I pray for that sweet day when beautiful dreams all come true.
When I went to a 2-year business school in New York, and every class that graduated always had a dance at the Waldorf afterwards. Our class did not, because none of us had any dates to take. You know, this doesn't make any difference to a hill of beans as far as your life is concerned, but it was one of the minor things that the war did. So the following year, after it was over, the dean invited us back, and we all went. I think we made closer friendships. It was a girls' school, and they came from New York, New Jersey, Long Island. But I think we got closer because weekends we didn't go home and date. So we would meet in New York to go to the theater or the ballet or something. So that those friends that I made I was quite close to for several years. Speaking of the bond drive, in between my 2 years of school, I was very fortunate because I had a friend, in those days they called the department Personnel Department. It's now Human Resources. There was a lady in the Macy's Personnel Department Douglaston was a small town like Lakewood. Everybody knew everybody. And she was working in the Personnel Department. She hired me and another one of her friends' daughters to work in Macy's over the summer. I was put in a typing pool because I'd had a year of typing. And I guess I convinced them that I was good enough and that I could be trusted enough that I was put on the first floor of Macy's department store to sell war bonds. That was Macy's contribution to the war. So I was trusted with the money because when I was in the typing pool, sometimes we would have to type up the bonds, and now I was able to sell them and type it up immediately and give it to the person while they waited. And then in the booth next to me was a lady who, from the Women's Army Corps, the WACs. She and I were as different as night and day because we got to talking to each other when neither one of us was busy. And she said, "How come you're not dating all these servicemen that are coming by?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I guess I've been too busy, but I can't tell you how many men she picked up over a period of time." Went out with later on, but she had her uniform to protect her. So that was Macy's contribution to the war effort. You know, it cost us $18.50, I think it was, for a $25 bond. And I used to buy them and give them to my mother and father for birthdays and that kind of thing, too. It was an acknowledgement for them, and it was part of the war effort. Everybody was buying the bonds then. I think it was $37.50 for a $50 bond.
How did you keep track of the war? What was the main...
Grand Central Station had a movie theater, and the only thing they showed was news, and it would change like every 3 days, so you knew which day it was going to change. So on your lunch hour or before you went home, you went over to Grand Central Station and you saw the latest of what was going on in Europe, basically, more so than Asia. And often in the regular theaters, sometimes if you knew the news was changing, even if you'd seen the movie, you might go back and see the movie again just to get caught up. That was our basic way to get the news, was through movies.
So these would be newsreels?
Only newsreels at Grand Central Station, that's all they did. We had gas, yes, because where I lived, it was considered part of New York City, so there were no junior driver's licenses. You had to be 18 before you could get a license. Well, gas was rationed, so the family would not allot gas for me to learn to drive. So I was in my 20s before I drove. And because of gas rationing, when I was going to school, my father and I, we probably had a 25-minute walk down to the Long Island Railroad. We walked down in the morning because you're all alert and what have you, but then Mother would meet us at night. Or else if there were two men coming home on the same train, one of the wives would meet us. So yes, the gas, people were careful in how they used their gas.
Dancing, dance cards.
There were USO.
USOs, yeah.
Yeah, all over the city. I went to those once or twice, and we just danced with the guys. Probably some of them made dates as time went on. But, yeah, so the USOs, and they had entertainment as well as the dances too. We had dance cards just when we would go to a formal dance, you'd have a dance card. And the guys would fill in their names for 1 through 8, depending upon how many dances there were that night. And then you always dance with the guy that you went with, the last one.
Yeah, save the last dance for me.
Yeah, but yeah, we had dance cards.
Oh my God.
So I don't think that really was connected to the war. I think it was a social way of life at that time.
This is the BBC Home Service. We're interrupting programs to make the following announcement. It is understood that in accordance with arrangements between the three great powers, an official announcement will be broadcast by the Prime Minister at 3 o'clock tomorrow. In view of this fact, tomorrow, Tuesday, will be treated as Victory in Europe Day.
We were in school that day, so the dean closed early because she knew there were going to be all these servicemen on the streets, and she didn't want her young ladies caught up with them. So she closed early, and the group that I was with went to a bar. I don't know maybe if you heard this at the dinner, stop me.
No, go ahead, no.
So we got to the bar, and I was behind the times, I guess, but I had never gone to a bar without a gentleman escort. But I guess some of these girls had. So in we go to the bar, and I'm shaking, wondering what I'm going to do in this bar without a male escort. Fortunately, they sat at a table. We didn't sit at the bar. But instead of going home, as the dean wanted us to get out of the city before all the boats landed, we did wander the streets a little bit. This Fort Totten was embarkation and debarkation, and that was right across the bay from us. So a lot of the women in Douglaston worked as gray ladies in the hospital there. So I don't know if you heard at the dinner, I was talking about New Year's Eve there.
No, go ahead.
Mother was a gray lady, so she corralled several of myself and some friends. We went over to the hospital on New Year's Eve to visit with the soldiers who didn't have anybody in the area and all. And of course, visitors had to be out at 10 o'clock. So then they took us over to the other part of the fort, which was the debarkation. And we were dancing with the guys there, and then all of a sudden they'd say 21. So whoever had 21 left to go debark at that particular moment. That's a New Year's Eve I'll never forget.
So I'm envisioning that the band is playing, you're dancing, the band ends a song, up comes a guy in a military uniform saying, the following numbers, please report.
Uh-huh.
Oh
And off they went.
Oh my gosh. Not knowing,
No.
whether this was your night or not.
Right.
Like Russian roulette with a dance.
They were, evidently this is where they held them when they knew, so that they would be there as needed. And the reason the hospital was there was because they could take them by boat from Manhattan to there.
You're the last female they would have danced with before they left.
Yes,
Oh,
the last live person they saw.
The last image they had was you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Forget
never-
Betty Grable.
Yeah, yeah. So as I say, that's a New Year's Eve that I will never forget. That's probably my most memorable thing of the whole year, of all the years.
With the war ending and an influx of people, what did that do to your town? Where all of a sudden these vets came in and were
Did
they
you-
treated differently? Were
Yes, they're welcomed.
Okay.
Did you ever hear of Levittown?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, there's one on Long Island and one in Pennsylvania. That was a result of all the servicemen coming back.
5 years ago, this was a vast checkerboard of potato farms on New York's Long Island. Today, a community of 60,000 persons living in 15,000 homes, all built by one firm. This is Levittown, one of the most remarkable housing developments ever conceived.
Was built with the idea that servicemen could buy a house at a very reasonable price rather than going to an apartment. And it was the first type of housing that was really villages. They had pools in, well, it was a huge complex, so they had probably 3 or 4 pools all in the complex. And I don't know whether they had tennis courts or not, but they had other activities. So that I had several friends whose that was their very first house, and they never did go to an apartment because they married a serviceman, and they went into these small houses that could be added onto. They were like 2-bedroom houses. Some of them would build on a 3rd bedroom. And I visited several people there, and it was a really great community. Everybody was the same age. They all visited back and forth on the streets, and nobody had a lot of money, so there was a lot of entertaining on your street with barbecues, and they were all having young children. And the mothers, most of them were still at-home mothers then, even though the war was the beginning of women going to work.
That's amazing. That's a great stories. A bunch of stories, Judy.
Yeah.
You lived it, and you're so articulate and so
Your memory bank is phenomenal.